Welcome to this episode of The World According to Irina Tsukerman, our very special series on global politics on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Irina Tsukerman is a US-based national security and human rights lawyer as well as a renowned geopolitical analyst. And her writings and commentary have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. Every fortnight in The World According to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show once again, Irina.
Thank you so much. Always glad to be here.
Thank you. Thank you, Irina. So, this is the 51st episode of our ongoing series. So, let's take several big topics again today, but let's first take up this whole UK, Canada, Australia, almost moving away from Washington unilateral recognition of Palestine amidst the start of UNGS.
There was a whole host of countries who, in recent weeks and at the UN General Assembly opening, has announced a unilateral recognition of Palestine with no defined borders, no defined leadership, and no defined directions. Those countries included Spain, Ireland, Norway, Slovenia, and at the summit, UK, France, Canada, Australia, and Portugal. So, what appears to be a moral cascade is also a political one. What unites all these otherwise very diverse countries is that the leaders of those countries are beset by scandals, inflation, protests, and legitimacy deficits. And they're looking for a lever with global resonance. The recognition of Palestine at the peak of international outreach repositions them as principled actors when domestic narratives paint them as compromised, at least in their effort to appeal to the Muslim and Arab world, both in terms of domestic constituencies, international NGOs, and Muslim and Arab countries. Now, Spain's Prime Minister Sanchez is wrestling with corruption probes that also affect his wife and other government members, as well as Catalonia's centrifugal politics. Recognition offers him a stature among Mediterranean countries, especially since Italy, next door, has been struggling with mixed messaging on this topic. Meloni did not sign off on this particular resolution, this particular agreement, but she has criticized Israel indirectly by showing support for Qatar after the recent bombing, for instance. And now he's trying to offer appearance of moral clarity, reframing a government on the defensive as a convener with a compass. Ireland is suffering a housing crisis and social strain and needs a unifying value statement. Dublin has traditionally used its own liberation story to align policy with popular sentiment and has essentially equated Palestinians as underdogs with the Irish versus the United Kingdom. So what happens is this gesture binds otherwise fractured constituencies to a national self-image of solidarity, despite many holes in that story. Norway, too, is dealing with an identity crisis of sorts. On the one hand, it's an energy and sovereign wealth powerhouse. On the other hand, it's being exposed as a hypocrite precisely because of those two things. Norway has been traditionally known for its peace brand. Recognition recenters Oslo as a custodian of diplomacy and shifting discourse from oil contradictions to moral stewardship in a conflict it once hosted on paper. Now, what about Slovenia? Slovenia sort of doesn't add up to these countries. It's small. It's not a superpower, but it's also dealing with corruption allegations and polarization. and it's using recognition to punch above its weight in the EU conversation. It's trying to reclaim agency by stepping onto the moral stage rather than just joining unanimity in whatever happens. The UK is also reeling from Partygate, that includes a recent reshuffle and the firing of a minister over misuse of government funding for personal apartment issues, as well as a cost of living crisis, and in general, stagnating economy that's been um, in that state since 2009. And it's seeking to reconnect with the younger and minority voters. So London wants to signal independence, humanitarian concern, to reassert global relevance post Brexit. It's been doing other things. It's been trying to reconnect with the EU, re-engage in assorted deals, and has also been reconnecting to France in that regard. But Starmer is extremely unpopular. Their recent losses in local to Labour in local elections in Wales, which show that Nigel Farage's Reform Party is on the rise, and polling too is indicating that Reform could perform much better than expected in the future elections. So Starmer is essentially trying to grab whoever he can. The assorted pro-Gaza minorities in the UK, so international support from Arab states, and so forth. France, too, is facing convulsions of pension protests as well as policing crisis. Also, relatively minor but still substantive uh, protests related to the Russia-Ukraine policy. So it's seeking to show responsiveness to justice narratives. In other words, Macron is trying to secure some sort of a legacy. He has two years remaining in office. He cannot run again. So his popularity rating is at all times low, maybe 19% or less. Recognition enables Paris to assert European leadership and a Gaullist autonomy from Washington while speaking to domestic unrest. It certainly doesn't help that Netanyahu and Macron have had multiple tensions over various issues. Netanyahu reportedly misled Macron over Lebanon. Eventually, of course, Israel secured a ceasefire with Lebanon, but not after significant escalations. He also had committed to providing Ukraine with tanks, which never materialized, and Macron is still bitter over that. So that certainly did not help matters. And Canada is also facing pressures, even though the government is new. Healthcare strain, inflation, assorted interference controversies, and it's trying to reframe itself as rules based and humane, and also join the English speaking countries, UK and Australia. Uh, Recognition addresses diaspora demands for visible principle while complicating other bilateral files, and Canada has also come under a great deal of criticism for its security posture, for being allegedly open to drug smuggling, human trafficking, and cartels, and even terrorism, being insufficiently hardline on security issues and too open to unvetted migrants. All of that is forcing Carney to try to reposition himself as part of a bloc, and to position himself vis-a-vis Trump. And this is the issue that seems to resonate the most with the most people. Australia too is dealing with multiple internal issues, and indigenous policy strife, as well as economic pains, and it's trying to appeal to position itself as a middle power with influence. Recognition of Palestine plays well in Arab capitals as well as among younger Australians. Typical issue across the Western world, and it anchors Canberra in both Western and Asian diplomatic circuits. Also, Bruce Becker globals, to and sees moral high ground cast itself as an ethical bridge between Europe and the global South. The Secretary General is from Portugal. He's often taken a very vocal position on Gaza. In fact, even promoting narratives that have been described as Hamas linked. He is very close to small clique of influential politicians, including the president of the country. Um, and the economy in Portugal in general has been quite poor, with a huge brain drain due to a loss of career opportunities inside the country. So this is again a great diversion. So now for Israel, that creates a very complicated diplomatic situation, because um, now issues that were once reserved for final status are now moving into the opening bid. And Abbas was actually precluded from by the United States from coming to New York, but he has still made an appearance via Zoom, and now there is heightened pressure on him to provide some sort of evidence of uh, responsibility, potential for reform, security coordination, and a credible path to political renewal. Nobody really expects that from the Palestinian Authority under his rule. He has already appointed a successor. There's no reason to believe that that successor will do any better. And for Hamas, the narrative fight is to celebrating and praising these steps. And while Hamas has repeatedly rejected the two-state solution, the fact that there is this unilateral recognition, even as hostages are still being bargained for by Hamas, and it recently fired more rockets at Israel, allows Hamas to claim victory among its supporters, and to recruit more people, both in Gaza and around the world on Western campuses, for example. For Europe, on the other hand, Europe is under pressure to deny that violence by Hamas actually brought the move, and that they are literally appeasing the people who brought about the October 7th related disaster to Gaza and elsewhere. So Washington is now being repositioned as an outlier among friends. Trump's fighting with European countries over tariffs, over Ukraine, and other issues has not helped. So now it's not just Israel that's being isolated, it's Washington's diplomatic hand that's being weakened. Uh, Now, even though the White House continues to be publicly skeptical of unilateral steps, it now faces a changed baseline among its allies. The new Western center of gravity makes statehood a premise, not a prize. The policy questions becomes conditionality and pace of implementation rather than a question of if. Now, Trump has been trying to locate supporters in Europe as well. Nigel Farage, the AfD in Germany, uh, Vucic in Serbia, Orban in Hungary, and Fico in Slovakia have all been his proponents. They all share a lot of common language, and so far they have been acting as more friendly towards Israel, and unwilling to take the same steps as others. For instance, Orban had welcomed Netanyahu, while many of the other European countries said they would abide by the very dubious ICC arrest warrants for Netanyahu, and several other Israeli officials, and that's just one example. However, what actually happens in the if a whole block of these people ends up in power is another question. In the meantime, Russia and China are the biggest winners of this debacle, having successfully divided Europe among themselves, divided Washington in Europe celebrated these announcements at the UN quite openly, although many are quietly skeptical about symbolism without delivery. Many in the Europe, the Arab world, are concerned that this move will empower Hamas and strengthen Islamists and Iran role in the region, will give undue legitimacy to Qatar, even though GCC and other Arab states felt they had to stand in public with Qatar against Israel's attack. In private, they are probably far less concerned that they made it out to be. And many of the countries in the region are rivals of Qatar, either economically, politically, or both. And this is seen as Doha's crowning achievement because it was Qatar that led the charge on the unilateral aspect of recognition, even as France and Saudis have tried to turn it more over a sort of more traditional two-state solution push. Nevertheless, it was ultimately the Qatari vision of this that has prevailed. Um, Recognition certainly doesn't conjure a state. It resets the conversation on terms currently most amenable to Hamas rather than Israel. Once major Western democracies cross the threshold, the reversal in the future by future governments is unlikely. The debate isn't whether anymore, it is how, when, and on what enforceable terms. So essentially, uh, the big winners unless Hamas violent factions are dispensed with, the winners of this are not going to be Palestinians, it's going to be terrorist organizations and their supporters.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. And I thought it was about Palestine, but it is the name is only Palestine. Everyone else is looking at it for internal benefit. So, how should we make how much of it is about Palestine? How much is it about the real issue at hand? And how does it impact the situation? What does Palestine got? And how do you think Israel must be looking at it?
Look, at the end of the day, they did not put any conditions on Hamas to give up the hostages. To the extent that Macron and maybe a couple of the others have made some conditionality link, it's certainly not being presented that way. All is being publicly announced is that France is joining those other countries. Now, the time to debate all of this would have been in the past year or so when some of these leaders started threatening and announcing their intent to make these comments. But they were either not taken seriously by Israel and Jewish communities in the White House, or to some extent, Washington actually preferred it that way because it makes Israel more dependent on the US, and also because it creates a division between Israel and Europe and between anti-Russia democracies and the more pro-Russian leaning bloc inside NATO. So at the end of the day, Israel too is being used as a proxy for other issues and conflicts in between Washington, Moscow, and Brussels. So we are seeing this realigning, and all of these countries, due to their lack of creativity, of internal failures, instability, and also social pressure that may not always be directly linked even to their policies, but may be just a cultural phenomenon blowing up. All of these issues of forcing some of these leaders to fall into a trap that Kremlin, Beijing, and others have set out for them. The more allies are polarized, the less they can work together and focus on fighting real threats to security, global authoritarianism. This would have been a perfect opportunity for Israel to join forces with Europe in terms of pushing and recognizing and enforcing the snapback sanctions on Iran, for instance. But that significant decision that is now being implemented, or is set to be implemented, has gained far less attention than this futile Palestine move, despite one having practical, immediate impact in terms of financial pressures, and the others being only a tool of propaganda that terrorists are likely to use. So that tells us all we need to do about the current political situation, where posturing and grandstanding appear to be far more important than actual serious financial and political consequences for pursuing illicit nuclear programs. It's a social media trolling battle versus serious policy is the bottom line here.
Absolutely. So, does it impact the situation on the ground? I think there's been talk about some solutions to the things on the in Gaza war, but how does it look like? Any of the solutions is going to stick, or it's going to be more and more human lives going by every day?
There are two competing solutions, neither of which is either linked to or affected by this unilateral state recognition. One is the Egyptian solution that would include a multilateral Arab force and significant reconstruction and a dedicated effort to remove Hamas from power and to replace it with some sort of a Palestinian transitional authority that eventually would lead to a more permanent government. Now, that proposal is good for one significant reason. It resonates and involves and includes the region, and it has credibility with the regional Arab actors. It's internal, it doesn't seem imposed by the West, and it has this Egypt realizes that it is probably unreformable in its current form. Now, the problem with it is that it does not yet include a significant narrative element, information space element that would build parallel structures in um, containing and rolling back the influence of Hamas across the region that created hostility to Israel and made cooperation on this on security and governance issues in the day after for Gaza nearly impossible at the current juncture. Without that crucial element, that plan is bound to fail. Another problem with it is that Trump is rejecting it. Trump's preferred solution comes from Jared Kushner and Tony Blair. Tony Blair is known for being involved in conflict zones. He and Tony Blair's focus is on basically reforming failed states. Jared Kushner is more focused on financial incentives and deals as a way of motivating and incentivizing factions to come together towards a more constructive result. Both of them share something in common. They have ties to Qatar, and that means that Qatari funding will be central to any reconstruction and securitization process. Now, what Tony Blair is proposing makes sense on a certain level. He is focused on pragmatic implementation, less on ideology. He's focused on identifying technocrats and implementers who can make the trains run on time and essentially ensure that basic administrative tasks are dealt with and that the governance is focused on governing, which Hamas was failing to do for so long in Gaza. The problem is, of course, if Qatar becomes a central actor in all of this, the funding is likely to be mismanaged and misallocated to violent factions, be they Hamas or somebody else. B, many other countries in the region will be opposed to Qatar's significant role in all of this due to their either economic rivalry, their own interest in reconstruction, or political and security concerns. And C, the fact that you have two people who stand to benefit financially of their role in reconstruction while also being Westerners creates a very problematic conflict of interest and makes it very likely that some portion of the funding will end up not going to directly to the people, but will end up benefiting Tony Blair, Jared Kushner, as has happened at least in Kushner's case with many other projects he's been involved in, and he's been criticized for that. But that is what the White House is approving of as of now. Now, neither scenario can really be implemented until Hamas is dealt with, which is what Israel is working on right now. That's the goal of the ongoing offensive in Gaza City, to dismantle all of military infrastructure for Hamas, to make it impossible for them to be cohesive in any military sense. And of course, the strike on Hamas in Qatar was made to ensure that the political leadership was removed, because I think Netanyahu realizes now that without dealing with that situated with on the military front, you also have to take the political aspects of the situation into consideration. But that is where we are. Neither plan is currently implementable in its current form. Both have significant weaknesses and concerns. And Egypt insists that only the Arab-backed plan could work in practice. Trump is pushing his own thing. Nobody is actually thinking that if there isn't a current movement to align agendas now, that point may never come, because even if Hamas is defeated by whatever definition you like to use, there are multiple violent factions in Gaza vying for power who could take over and render this whole debate null and void before it either gets a chance to get off the ground. So I think everyone is making a mistake in not working with Israel closer to actually start building and implementing a transitional framework before Hamas is quote unquote defeated, whatever that actually means, and however Israel ends up defining it.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. From there, let's move on to the H1-B visa issue. What's happening on that front? Trump wants only high-paid workers in the U.S., and everyone else has to work in their own countries. Help us understand what's happening on that front. How it's going to impact, especially a very close impact on India also.
So there's been a bit of a mixed messaging on this issue. Initially, Lotnik came out claiming that the 100,000 price tag for H1B is an annual thing that employers will have to pay to support the visa holders every year. Catherine Leavitt, the White House spokes, said that it's a one-time deal, and afterwards renewals are going to be for free, I guess. She also basically said, or at no additional significant cost. She didn't say if there was, in fact, any additional cost and what that would be, but it would be $100,000. She also said that the current visa holders would not be affected, which is not what Lutnick implied. So far, it's not clear which one of them was telling the real story, or whether there is a concrete policy that's been defined in any particular written form. But regardless of whether it's annual or a one-time deal, it's still a very high price tag, and it refrains the H1-B visa from a skills gateway into a rationing valve. It immediately privileges large incumbents that can absorb compliance, meaning huge corporations and top universities closely aligned to Trump, while forcing startups, small businesses, and mid-sized firms to rethink hiring in a market already short on advanced STEM talent. And that's not just technology, but medical professions that are affected. Many nurses and residents, 30% of medical residents come from abroad. There's a huge shortage of doctors and top level skilled nurses in the US. Um, so that's going to be a major problem. It could wipe out all rural medicine for many Americans. The intent is to signal pro American worker, but the instrument functions like an industrial policy sledgehammer. Now, Indian talent bears the brunt because of scale and specialization. The pipeline from Indian universities and especially IT services into US role is the world's largest. Repricing the channel overnight hits early career candidates and small sponsors first, even in fields where US supply is thin. It suppresses mobility precisely where the innovation flywheel needs it. Ironically, the policy can entrench the very intermediaries it claims to curb. Body shopping conglomerates can amortize fees across portfolios, while direct hire innovators balk at a per capita surcharge that punishes quality over volume, that tilts the field away from the high value for hires that the economy actually depends on. The knock-on effect is uneven wage inflation in genuinely scarce niches such as power electronics, battery chemistry, semiconductor EDA, industrial controls. Employers will swallow costs, but in commoditized software, they'll defer offshore or automate. The net is not a renaissance of domestic hiring as much as a relocation of risk. So we will see the second wave of outsourcing that everybody is now criticizing for killing off US manufacturing back in the 90s. And it will, whatever criticism people have about AI taking away early career jobs, it will certainly speed up the process. Exactly the same way automation was given a boost by the raising of minimum of federal minimum and state minimum wage in the United States. Graduate education also takes a hit, by the way, under these circumstances. Fewer students will bet on US degrees if the work ladder is priced as a luxury good. Canada, the UK, Australia, European countries with clearer study to work corridors gain by default expect major brain drain. That erodes the US soft power loop that converts classrooms into labs and labs into startups. Let's recall that many Indian students stay in the US. They do not go back to India. They actually work and they actually benefit the US economy by first being educated there and then contributing to the working sphere. India's ecosystem, by the way, gains some stickiness. Talent that kept up may push wage floors in leading cities such as Bengaluru and Hyderabad, deepen local research benches, and persuade multinationals to expand R&D in India rather than import skills. So, in that case, the strategic autonomy would actually improve, and the bilateral talent bridge narrows. But for US manufacturing and onshoring agenda, the timing is awkward. Rebuilding fabs, grid hardware, and advanced machinery needs scarce skills now. Raising import frictions for those skills fights the other arm of the policy. The left hand signals reshoring, the right hand taxes its inputs. Compliance also risks further privileges for coastal mega firms and Trump's cronies. The new wage floor is one line in a wider ledger. Audits, processing delays, litigation exposure. Sponsors can't absorb all of that, freezing requisitions. The result is consolidation, not competition. more monopolies, more conglomerates and cartels, fewer independent layers, anti-elite sentiment. Immigration is a stage to act tough, but the smarter lever would tie fees to scarcity, wage percentiles, and sponsor record, while fast-tracking permanent residency for critical degrees and national interest roles. In short, this this 100K threshold prices out the dynamism that policy claims to protect. It will shrink abuse at the margin, certainly, but it will accelerate talent flows that underpin innovation's reshoring ambitions.
Right, right, Irina. So, does it look like to you that it will this whole H1B visa issue is only short-lived and it will come back to normal, or the world will have to prepare for this new set of rules by the US?
Well, I have to say, looking at briefly at this proposal, it seems that it's at will. In other words, the US government can exempt at whatever time they want. So I see this as a corrupt issue, right? For abuse, cronies get exemptions to pursue successful businesses. Others either get kicked to the curb, or they have to pay bribes to circumvent these controls, depending on how it ends up actually being implemented. Either way, the American people lose.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now let's look at the India-US trade talks. They continue, and does it look like that? The visa issue will also obviously come in, and there might be some concessions there. How does this whole thing about India-US trade talks look like to you from that part of the world, Irina, and especially the H1B visa issue? Do you think India will be able to manage some sort of concessions for its own self?
Well, Trump softened his language towards Prime Minister Modi recently. Nevertheless, he did not untie the visa issue from the tariff issue. And so far, although the trade talks have resumed and have been ongoing for a few days, major breakthroughs have not thus far been announced, which is concerning. Uh, the fact that the docket is staying open signals that both capitals still see net gains in grinding forward, but that doesn't mean that the journey is going to be easy or smooth. The tariffs are just the visible tip. Standards are the mass below the waterline. Digital services taxes, data localization, conformity assessments, and SPS rules will decide whether firms treat markets as predictable or capricious. A lot will depend on trust. And right now, there is a big concern about supply chain de-risking because what we are seeing already is supply chain delays across the board in various areas. Washington wants alternatives to choke points. New Delhi wants to turn that appetite into plants, components, ecosystems, and export finance that outlast these cycles. The geometry of friendshoring is being drawn in annexes, not headlines. So there's a lot of unlock gains which will dwarf tariff micro wins, especially for companies that export talent and code rather than just containers. Now, for the US, the big issue is market access, and it's braided into its industrial policy. Chip subsidies, clean tech credits, procurement rules which embed made here preferences, carving trusted partner on ramps without detonating domestic their cake and eat it too. They want to have this unfettered access to India's huge markets, but on the other hand, they want to have all this being produced in the US. So it kind of doesn't really work that way. It takes two to tango, and you need to have a bit of a give and take if you want to come to terms on any deal. Now, the big one of the big stumbling blocks has been agriculture. Dairy protocols, residues, biotech approvals are important to constituencies in both countries. And sequencing also matters. Pilots, science panels, and limited corridors could build confidence before big asks. If that is overcome, as I've mentioned previously, the countries can take those wins and build them towards something more significant on fronts. But again, for whatever reason, we see that this whole trade ties all these issues together instead of separating them into manageable segments where each side can get some small but measurable wins and build goodwill that way. Another issue that's been the subject of these talks is digital trade. It has the longest half life. Cross border data rules, algorithmic accountability, and cybersecurity cooperation can are big issues in deciding whether startups treat the economic corridor being built between the two countries as frictionless or Byzantine. And this is something that's been very much on India's radar. And cybersecurity cooperation with the US has been a very promising frontier, but not if the administration continues to put tariffs and public posturing above actual dedication to technical, to building something on a technical level. Another issue is dispute settlement. What is needed is a mechanism that is clear to benefit from political storms situation tends to favor vague ad hoc backstops, which do not signal seriousness. Boardrooms read the fine print. It's as simple as that, and Trump is not a fine print, detail-oriented kind of guy, which is why ideally these deals would be negotiated by technocratic bureaucrats and civil servants, not by political appointees who have just the command to carry agenda, not to deal with the technicalities. Unfortunately, U.S. has significantly curtailed the numbers of diplomats dedicated to this task, so it's unclear who's actually taking care of this fine minutia. At the end of the day, both sides can gain by framing the architecture as a platform, not a finish line. When companies believe problems can be solved sooner or later, capital. Look, what a win would look like in the short term is a handful of tangible wins: component tariffs, trims, trusted supplier lanes, joint standard pilots, and then momentum can compound. Trade ecosystems are layered, not lived. The scaffolding is rising, but unfortunately, once again, the Trump team will win unless it's huge, unless it's very complex, and unless they can make this big, splashy announcement. In my opinion, any wins at this point are worthy of such treatment, just because so much damage has been done.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. From there, let's stay with the US and talk about TikTok. What happens to TikTok? Others are having to bear the brunt of new policies, but TikTok seems to be getting saved in some way or the other. How should we understand? Is it going to be there in the same form or in a different form?
Look, at the end of the day, both China and US claimed victory in this battle. US claims that it's retaining data, retaining the algorithm, and getting money. Um, China claims that it actually retains control. The reality is, whether TikTok is actually saved is a question, is a debatable question. It means, I think what's clear is that the issue, the controversy is being contained. What a lot remains, a lot depends on implementation. Will the US ring fence its data? Will it vet the code? Will the third party audits be implemented? And will there be a clear oversight regime that treats a viral app like critical infrastructure? Will compliance ensure that China does not actually abuse its power, and that both the algorithm and data are actually under the US control and not just so on paper? Security concerns are not about dances, they're about who can see what, who can change what, and who can compel what under stress. In other words, the public does not really know or understand whether or not US and China actually um, play the role they claim to be playing. Transparency here is still severely lacking, as are details of that deal. Any settlement that can't answer those questions clearly and under crisis conditions is cosmetic. And this is, I'm afraid, what we are facing now. Operationally, this containment would look like localized data centers, restricted engineer access, reproducible builds, auditable moderation workflows. This process, if implemented correctly, of course, and taken seriously, would be intrusive and expensive, but it would be the price of permission to operate at scale. The First Amendment here would be the guardrail. Blanket bans on a speech platform would invite strict scrutiny. Tailored remedies withstand courts better and avoid setting precedents that chill the broader creator economy. Prudence is also legal strategy. The advertisers for TikTok are pragmatic. If engagement is strong and brand safety tools are credible, they'll continue to spend. If regulatory risk threatens campaign continuity, budgets will flow to safer pipelines. The compliance cage is a revenue mode. Right now, the investors are already flocking at an early stage without even knowing the details of the deal, and that's a high risk venture. They're taking Trump on his word. Personally, I'd be more skeptical. Um, and as for creators and small businesses, they price continuity over purity. They don't really care about the details. They just want TikTok to not be shut down indefinitely. Regulated TikTok that pays the bills millions of micro entrepreneurs with no lobbies. And competitors, at the end of the day, quietly fall right to a dead one. Erasure antitrust heat. A constrained TikTok lets reels and shorts adrift by decree. So the market would rebalance without trust busting headlines. Another for is election cycles, which are typically stress tests. Will the quote unquote show see political relegation. Safe for now should and could be probationary. Good behavior would reset clocks, missteps would reset entire coalitions around the stage. If what he is saying, if experts come back and say that, regardless of who controls, of whether controlling TikTok or company controls TikTok, if we're seeing level of foreign intervention for the day will be shaped by regulated coexistence. Will the audits of the company have teeth, or will it be simply a shell for China, with technically American, technically under U.S. control, but actually providing China with all the controls? Um,
Absolutely.
What happens as threat models evolve? All of these questions are yet to be answered, and right now we are not getting much clarity. In fact, it's very hard to say what's actually happening, other than money is changing hands, and both China and Trump are equally happy, which is not necessarily a good thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now the whole world wants to talk to the US, and a lot of things are happening. Even US Taliban is talking to the US, and as the talks go, they reject US request, efforts to recover US base in Afghanistan. So what's happening? Why are they rejecting? How are they rejecting US request? Do they have so much of wherewithal? And what does US want to do with the base again in Afghanistan?
So, what Trump initially wanted was a seemingly maximal in symbol. Once the centerpiece of the U.S. Afghan war, and the plan was to recast it as a logistic and counterterrorism node against ISIS-K. The Taliban, however, slammed the door instantly and publicly. Trump by the United States, it was not. It was built in Afghanistan back in the 60s and improved through the 70s and 80s by the Soviet Union. In the 1990s, it went to the Soviet-backed Afghan government, and then for years, it switched between different factions in Afghanistan. In 1996, Taliban gained control of it and control. So that base has a long and fraught history, and actually, U.S. Did not control it for most of it.
Yes, Irina, are you there? Your audio is not coming. So,
For
yes, yes. Your I'm not getting your audio, Irina. I mean, it looks like to be some technical issue.
oh, yeah. I'm back. I'm back.
Okay, okay. So, if that answer is we can take the next topic now.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah. I was
okay.
just
So,
going to say that. Hello,
yes, yes, Irina, I can
hello.
hear you. Yes, Irina, I can hear you.
Yeah. I was just going to say that essentially, for the Taliban, it's the last of the sovereignty. They don't have cash to spend. They have consular access, counter-terror assurance. But the one thing U.S. is not going to do is go to war with the Taliban over that base. That's definitely not going to happen. And it's probably going to lose priority over time. For Trump, Afghanistan, despite the rise in terrorism there, is not a priority. So this issue will probably go away in a little bit.
Absolutely, absolutely. Lots of things happening with the US. And the last we topic of the day is the Pakistan's defense deal with Saudi Arabia. Is it a message to the United States? I thought, Pakistan has gotten close to the US with its general visiting US and Trump promising to find oil in Pakistan, and they go and do a deal with Saudi Arabia. It's almost like NATO. Means one attack on one is an attack on both.
Well, it's certainly being cast that Islam also by but the Islamic bloc is more complicated, and Pakistan's relationship with Saudi Arabia is also very complicated. It goes back many decades. there's been a very close political interconnection between the military and also some political factions, but other political factions have also been traditionally close to Iran, which creates a very complicated dynamic. What we do know is that Saudis basically cooperated with the US during the Cold War via Pakistan, and Pakistan became a sort of trusted intermediary. But at the same time, the Islamist groups formed very close ties to their Islamist counterparts in Saudi Arabia, and now both of these factions are joining forces. Yes, formally, this is a formality in some ways because of the closeness of defense cooperation between the two countries for many years. It's a signal to the US exclusive on the US that it will go to other countries, but it is also a channel for other things. For instance, for indirect Chinese defense influence. For instance, access to nuclear weapons. For other reasons that may not have anything to do with Israel, for reshaping and consolidating the entire Sunni bloc, um, for strengthening an opportunity for Saudi broader involvement in Southeast Asia, including the securitization of economic corridors. So we are going to see a lot of things going on, and not all of them are going to be particularly great, especially if all of this involves informal factions that operate under the face of the security of the defense ministries, but in reality advocate tribal or private interests that have nothing to do with national concerns of either country.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. There's lots of things happening in the world, and we'll come back again with your insights on helping us understand what's all is happening. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of The World According to Irina Tsukerman on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much.